The train from Cheyenne stopped at Windbreak just after noon, and Hannah Cole stepped down with a sleeping child on her shoulder, two older children close behind her, and one brown trunk that held everything she still owned. She was 30 years old, a widow, and before the tall rancher waiting beside the depot could remove his hat, Hannah said the sentence she had rehearsed for 300 miles. No man asks for a wife and means to get 3 children with her. Her voice did not break. That was the miracle of it. My letters told you the truth, Mr. Price. I have a girl of 11, a boy of 8, and a little one not yet 4. I came because you had the right to refuse me in person. I would rather hear no on this platform than live under a roof where my children are counted against me. Gideon Price did not answer quickly. He looked first at Hannah, then at the girl beside her, straight-backed and watchful, with hands clenched around the handle of a carpet-bag, then at the boy who had already forgotten his own fear long enough to stare at the saddle horses tied outside the depot, then at the little child asleep against Hannah's collar, one red mitten dangling loose from her wrist, and Gideon smiled, not the polite smile of a man trying to hide disappointment, the kind of smile a man gives when a locked door opens. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "I did not write for a wife so I could keep living in a silent house." Then he looked at the 3 children again. "I asked the Lord for a family. Seems to me he sent one whole, instead of making me wait piece by piece." Hannah stood perfectly still, because kind words are easy on a depot platform. It is the living with them that tells the truth. And Hannah Cole had spent 2 years learning that kindness toward a widow with 3 children often lasted only until supper was late, until boots needed buying, until a boy spilled milk, until a little girl cried at the wrong hour. So she did not smile back. Not yet. The oldest child was named Ada. She was 11 and had already learned the heavy art of watching adults for signs of weather. The boy was Jonah, 8 years old, thin as a rail, all elbows and hunger and questions he had been told not to ask. And the little one was Nettie, not quite 4, with a calico rabbit tucked under one arm and that red mitten half off her hand. Gideon reached for Hannah's trunk. "It is 7 miles to the ranch," he said. "The horses are watered. The little one can sleep in the wagon." Hannah let him take the trunk because refusing would have looked foolish. But she held Nettie tighter. And all the way out across the Laramie Plain, with the grass silvering in the wind and the wagon wheels knocking over hard ground, Hannah waited for Gideon Price to understand what he had promised. She waited for him to begin counting. To understand why Hannah could not believe a generous word, you have to know what had been taken from her before she ever came west. 2 years earlier, Hannah had lived in Iowa with her husband, Matthew Cole, in a narrow rented house behind the grist mill. It was not a grand life, but it was a warm one. Matthew worked long hours. Hannah kept the stove going. Ada read to Jonah from the same primer until the pages softened. Nettie was still a baby then, round-cheeked and reaching for anything that shone. They were not rich, they were not important, but they belonged to each other. Then Matthew caught a winter sickness after 3 days of hauling soaked grain sacks in sleet. At first it was only a cough, then it was a fever, then his breathing turned shallow and strange, as if every breath had to climb a hill. The doctor came once, then again. Then there was nothing more to do but sit beside the bed and listen to the man Hannah loved fight for air. Matthew Cole was 32 years old when the house went quiet. Remember that winter sickness. Not because sickness was rare in those years. It was not. It moved through towns and farms and camps the way bad weather moved across open country. Remember it because Hannah remembered it every time one of her children coughed in the night. And because, before this story is done, another small chest will struggle for breath under another roof. After Matthew died, Hannah discovered that grief was not the only thing a widow had to survive. There was rent, there was flour, there were coal bills, there were shoes. Always shoes. She took in mending until her fingers cracked. She washed linen for a boarding house. She stretched soup so thin it looked almost clear, and still the money went down. Not slowly, down, like water in a bucket with a nail hole. But the thing that changed Hannah was not the work. Hannah could work. It was the way people began to look at her children. The landlord looked at Ada, Jonah, and Nettie and saw 3 reasons Hannah might miss rent. The churchwomen were kind in public and careful in private. And the few men who showed interest after Matthew had been dead a respectable while all did the same thing sooner or later. They looked at Hannah. Then they looked at the children. Then something moved behind their eyes. A calculation. How many plates? How many blankets? How many winters? How much noise? One man came to supper in March. He had decent boots and a decent reputation. And Hannah tried to believe that maybe decency could be enough. Then Jonah knocked over a cup of buttermilk. It spread across the table and dripped onto the floor, and the man's face changed before he could stop it. Not anger exactly, worse, cost. Hannah saw in that one small accident what the world had decided she was. A woman alone might still be a beginning. A woman with 3 children was an invoice. So when she answered Gideon Price's advertisement, she did it with a hard honesty meant to scare him off. The notice had been printed in a Cheyenne paper and copied east by a cousin. A rancher in Wyoming Territory, 36, owner of good pasture and a sound house, wished to correspond with a respectable woman who would consider marriage. Hannah read the words until they blurred. Then she wrote a letter. And on the first page, before she mentioned her cooking, her health, or her church membership, she wrote the truth. I am a widow. I have 3 children. I will not come without them. I will not hide them in soft language. They are good children, but they are children. And children need food, patience, boots, schooling, and room to be alive. She sealed the letter, expecting silence. But silence did not come. Gideon Price wrote back in a hand that leaned hard to the right, like a man always working into wind. He wrote about the ranch, about the winters that shut the road, about the creek that ran high in spring, about a house built larger than one man needed. And near the end, he wrote the sentence Hannah folded and unfolded so many times the paper nearly split. A house with no children's noise in it is only a building. Do not think you would be bringing me extra trouble. Trouble is a table set for 1 when the table was built for 6. Hannah did not believe that line. She wanted to. That was the danger. But wanting had become expensive. So she sold what she could not carry, packed 1 trunk, took Ada, Jonah, and Nettie west, and decided she would let the man see them in the plain light of day. If he regretted his own kindness, Let him do it before she unpacked. Now, Hannah did not yet know Gideon Price's story. That was part of the trouble. A person cannot trust what they cannot understand. Gideon had grown up in Kansas in a sod house, where there were 6 children, 1 room, 2 beds, and never enough silence for anyone to think. He had been the second oldest. He had shared everything: a pillow, a blanket, a biscuit, blame, and he had loved it. He loved the quarrels and the elbows at the table. He loved babies crying in the night and older boys sneaking out before dawn. He loved the feeling that the house itself was breathing, because so many people lived inside it. But houses empty by degrees. 2 sisters married and moved south. An older brother went to the railroads. Another brother died after a horse rolled on him. His mother took sick and faded before Christmas. His father followed 3 springs later, and one little sister, May, the child Gideon had carried on his back when she was small, died of the croup during a blue-black January night when the doctor was 20 miles away and no horse in the barn could outrun the storm. Gideon had been 15. Old enough to remember every sound, too young to save her. Years later he built his own ranch house in Wyoming. He built it stubbornly. 4 rooms upstairs, a kitchen big enough for 3 women to work in, a table long enough to make one man look ridiculous sitting at the end of it. Every board he planed, he imagined noise. Children's boots on the stairs, a woman singing out of tune in the kitchen, doors banging, someone laughing when they ought to be sleeping. Then the house was finished, and there was no one in it but Gideon Price. At night the silence did not feel peaceful. It felt like being the last person left after a story ended. So when Hannah Cole's letter arrived with 3 children listed like warnings, Gideon read it twice, then sat a long time with the paper in his hand. She thought she was confessing a burden. He thought she had described the one thing his land could not grow. The Price Ranch sat in a shallow valley where cottonwoods bent toward the creek, and the wind never seemed to run out of breath. When the wagon topped the last rise, Hannah saw a whitewashed house larger than she expected. A barn, a smokehouse, a chicken yard. A half-built school shelf in the parlor that looked as if someone had started preparing for children and then stopped. There were 4 rooms upstairs. Hannah counted them immediately, not with relief, with strategy. There is room here, she thought, for us to keep out of his way. That was her plan. She would make the children grateful, useful, small. Ada could help with dishes. Jonah could stay away from the horses unless invited. Nettie could be kept in the kitchen with her calico rabbit and her thumb. If the children caused no trouble, perhaps Gideon would not regret them. And for the first week, Hannah worked so hard at not being a burden that she made the whole house uneasy. She hushed Jonah whenever his voice rose. She pulled Nettie back from the parlor rug the moment Gideon entered. She sent Ada for chore after chore until the girl moved with the careful tiredness of a child trying to earn her place indoors. Gideon noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed Jonah going stiff when he came into the room. He noticed Nettie hiding her rabbit behind her back as if toys were trespassers. He noticed Ada watching him the way a person watches a gate latch in high wind. And he noticed Hannah apologizing for things no one had accused her of. The first crack in Hannah's plan came over a saddle. Jonah had stared at Gideon's horses since the depot, especially a broad-faced sorrel named Pilgrim. On the 6th morning, while Hannah was kneading bread, Jonah slipped out to the barn. When Hannah realized he was gone, fear shot through her so hard she dropped flour across the table. She ran outside, already preparing the apology. "I am sorry. He knows better. I will make sure it does not happen again." But the barn was quiet. Inside, Jonah stood on an overturned grain bucket while Gideon held Pilgrim's bridle low enough for the boy to see. Gideon was showing him how to check the leather for cracks. "Not with your eyes only," Gideon said. "With your fingers. Leather lies cleaner than it feels." Jonah listened as if he had been handed a secret map. Hannah stopped in the doorway. "Jonah," she said too sharply, "you must not bother Mr. Price while he works." Gideon looked up. "Mrs. Cole," he said gently, "a boy who wants to learn honest work is not bothering me." Then he handed Jonah the strap. "Let him find the crack." And Hannah stood there with her apology still waiting in her mouth, useless. Nettie crossed the line next. Her calico rabbit was named Juniper, though nobody knew why. It had one brown button eye, one missing ear, and a body gone flat from being loved too hard. One evening, the remaining ear tore loose. Nettie made the kind of sound only a child can make when the world ends over a piece of cloth. Hannah was upstairs helping Ada with a hymn. By the time she came down, she expected to find Nettie scolded, or at least in the way. Instead, Gideon Price was sitting at the kitchen table with a harness needle, brown thread, and juniper in his large hands. He did not know how to sew. That was plain. His stitches were crooked. One knot sat out like a burr. He stabbed his own thumb twice and pretended not to. But Nettie stood beside his knee, solemn as a judge, watching him repair that torn rabbit ear, as though no doctor, minister, or governor in the territory had ever performed a greater work. Remember that rabbit. Remember Juniper with the crooked brown stitches in one ear. Because years later, when Hannah finally understands what belongs to a child and what belongs to a family, those stitches will be the proof. Ada was harder. Ada had learned too much too early. She had watched her father cough himself weak. She had watched her mother count coins after the children were supposed to be asleep. She had watched adults speak kindly over her head and make decisions underneath the kindness. Ada was polite to Gideon. She was helpful. She was never rude. But she did not give him 1 inch of herself, and Gideon, to his credit, did not try to buy that inch. He did not corner her with questions. He did not demand affection. He did not call himself anything he had not earned. He simply stayed steady. Monday, he was the man who let Jonah handle tack. Tuesday, he was the man who fixed Juniper's ear. Wednesday, he was the man who noticed Ada carrying too many stove logs and silently took half the load without making a speech of it. Thursday, he was the same. Friday, he was the same. For a watchful child, sameness is not boring. Sameness is safety arriving in small pieces. But Hannah still did not believe. She saw Gideon with Jonah. She saw Nettie leaning against his boot. She saw Ada stop flinching when he crossed a room, and still Hannah waited for the bill to come due. Because Hannah had learned that kindness could be like sugar in tea. Sweet at first, gone quickly, leaving the cup exactly as bitter as before. Then the early storm came. It was October too soon for the sky to turn that mean, but Wyoming never asked permission. By late afternoon, the wind had shoved a wall of cold rain across the valley. By dark, the rain had turned hard and white. It rattled against the windows like thrown gravel. The children were meant to stay close to the kitchen stove. But Nettie discovered that one red mitten was missing. The red mitten from the depot. The one Hannah had mended twice. The one Nettie believed, with a child's private certainty, could not be replaced by any other mitten in the world. No one saw her slip out the back door. Ada noticed first. "Where is Nettie?" Those 3 words emptied Hannah's lungs. They found the little girl near the woodpile, crying more from fright than cold, mitten clutched in her hand, shoes soaked through, cheeks bright red from the wind. Gideon carried her inside against his coat. Hannah stripped the wet clothes off, wrapped her in blankets, put warm stones near her feet, held her until the trembling stopped. By midnight, Nettie was coughing. By 2 in the morning, the cough had changed. It tightened. It barked. It caught at the top of her throat like a door that would not open. Hannah knew that sound. Not exactly, not from Nettie, but she knew the terror of listening to someone fight for breath. The room narrowed. The lamp flame blurred. For one terrible moment, she was back in Iowa beside Matthew's bed, hearing that same cruel labor in the dark. Gideon came to the doorway and saw her face. He did not ask whether she was afraid. He could see it. He stepped once into the room, listened to Nettie's breathing, then turned. "I am going for Doc Mercer." Hannah looked up. "The road is ice." "I know it. It is 7 miles to town. 9 by the safer crossing. The storm. I know the storm." Gideon was already pulling on his coat. And then the old voice inside Hannah spoke, the voice built from unpaid bills, changed faces, careful women, and men who counted children like debts. Now he sees a sick child in the middle of the night, a doctor to pay, a horse risked on an iced road, a house full of children who can need more than a man meant to give. Now he will start counting, and some broken part of Hannah almost wanted him to, because dread is exhausting, and if the kindness was going to end, let it end quickly. But Gideon Price did not count. He saddled Pilgrim in sleet that cut sideways. He tied a lantern high. He rode out before Hannah could find another warning. The night stretched thin. Ada sat on the floor by Nettie's bed with her knees drawn up. Jonah stood beside the window until Hannah sent him back to the stove. Hannah held Nettie upright because she breathed a little easier that way. Every cough sounded like a question no mother should have to answer. Before dawn, hooves struck the yard. Gideon came back gray-faced and iced over, with Doc Mercer hunched in the wagon beside him, medical bag between his knees. The doctor worked fast. Steam. Cloths. A dose measured by lamplight. Instructions delivered in a low voice. "It is croup," he said at last. "Bad enough. But not beyond us if we keep her breathing steady and the room damp. Not beyond us." Hannah held those words the way a drowning person holds a rope. Gideon did not go to bed. He should have. His hands shook from cold. His coat could stand by itself with ice. There was a streak of blood on one cheek where wind-blown sleet had cut him. But he stayed. All that day and the next night, Gideon and Hannah took turns with Nettie. He carried kettles, hung damp cloths, sat with the child upright against his chest when Hannah's arms trembled too badly to hold her, spoke to her in a low murmur about Pilgrim and the chickens and how Juniper the rabbit was waiting for orders. On the second night the storm passed. The house was so quiet Hannah could hear water drip from the eaves. Nettie finally slept without fighting every breath. Hannah sat across the bed from Gideon in the thin lamp glow, both of them hollow-eyed, too tired for pride, and she asked the question that had been choking her since the depot. "Why?" Gideon looked at her. Hannah's voice was barely sound. "Why would you do this? She is not yours. None of them are yours. You could have chosen a woman with no children at all. You could have had peace." Gideon looked down at Nettie. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he rubbed both hands over his face, and when he spoke, all the careful distance was gone from him. "My little sister died of the croup when I was 15. Hannah went still. Her name was May. She was small enough that I could carry her on my back. That night my father tried to get the doctor, but the snow had taken the road. I sat in the corner and listened to her breathe like that, and I could not do one blessed thing." His voice roughened. "I have carried that sound for 20 years. He looked at Nettie again. "When I heard it in this room I did not think, there is someone else's child. I thought, this time I can ride." Then Gideon met Hannah's eyes. "You keep speaking of these children as if they are weight you are asking me to bear. Hannah, they are not the weight. The empty house was the weight. Remember Matthew Cole's winter sickness. Remember the breath Hannah could not save. Remember Gideon's little sister and the storm road that would not open. Because this was the turn. The same kind of helplessness that had taken from both of them had come again. Only this time it found a horse in the barn, a man willing to ride, a doctor brought before dawn, a mother who did not have to sit alone. And this time the child lived. Nettie woke late the next morning cross, hungry and offended that everyone looked so worried. Her first word was not Mama. It was Juniper. That was how they knew she was herself again. Ada saw all of it. The oldest children always do. She saw Gideon leave in the storm. She saw him return with the doctor. She saw him sit in a chair too small for him, holding Nettie through the night while his own head dipped with exhaustion and jerked awake again. Ada watched the floor beneath her family. The floor she had expected to give way. It held, and a child who has spent years bracing for the fall does not become trusting all at once. But she can, one morning, take one hand off the wall. The morning Nettie asked for food, Ada found Gideon in the barn, rubbing Pilgrim down again because the horse had earned better care than any man could give him. Ada stood in the doorway. "Mr. Price?" Gideon turned. "Yes, Ada." She looked at Pilgrim, then at the floor, then at Gideon. "Thank you for riding in the storm." He nodded once, because he understood better than to make her kindness too large to carry. "You're welcome." Ada swallowed. Then she said, quickly, as if the words might burn her if held too long, "My pa would have gone." And she left before Gideon could answer. But Gideon stood beside that horse for a long while after she was gone, because he knew exactly what Ada had handed him. Not affection, not yet. Something rarer, comparison. A watchful child had measured him beside the father she had lost, and for one small moment he had not been found wanting. The conversation that changed the house happened 4 nights later. Nettie was well enough to sleep in her own bed. Jonah had fallen asleep at the kitchen table after claiming he was not tired. Ada had covered him with a shawl without admitting she had done it. Hannah came downstairs and found Gideon mending a bridle by lamplight. The house smelled of wet wool, bread crust, and wood smoke. For the first time since she arrived, Hannah sat down not because she had work to do, but because she needed to speak. Gideon set the bridle aside. He had learned that silence could be a door if a person did not rush through it. Hannah folded her hands. "I have been waiting for you to change your mind," she said. Gideon did not interrupt. "Since the platform. Since before the platform. I kept thinking, if I can keep them quiet, if I can keep them helpful, if I can keep us from needing too much, maybe you will not see what you have taken on." Her mouth trembled. She pressed it flat, angry at herself. "In Iowa, I watched people count my children in front of me without moving their lips. I watched men decide what I was worth by how much bread my children might eat. I learned to make them small." Her voice broke then. "That is the shame of it. They were already grieving, and I still kept trying to make them smaller." Gideon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Do you think I do not know what it is to make a house small?" Hannah looked at him. So Gideon told her the rest. Not the neat sentence from the letter. Not the careful version a lonely man writes to a stranger. He told her about the Kansas house packed full of children, about biscuits cut in half and beds shared crosswise, about the noise he once thought would never end. He told her about May, about the storm, about sitting useless in the corner while his mother whispered prayers over a child who could not pull air. He told her about building this house too large on purpose, about the table meant for more plates, about walking from room to room after dark and hearing every floorboard answer back because there was no one else to make sound. Then Gideon said the words Hannah would remember for the rest of her life. "You came here believing you were bringing me a debt." He shook his head. "You brought me back the part of a house that cannot be built with lumber. Not the walls, not the roof, not the land, the living." Hannah closed her eyes. Gideon continued, "I do not want your children quiet on my account. I do not want Ada working herself old before her time. I do not want Jonah swallowing every question he has. I do not want Nettie hiding that rabbit like Joy is something she should apologize for." His voice dropped. "I built this house for noise, Hannah. Let it be noisy." That was the first time he called her Hannah. Not Mrs. Cole. Hannah. And something inside her, something held tight for so long it had become part of her posture, loosened all at once. She put her hands over her face and wept. Not politely, not prettily, not the soft kind of crying women are allowed to do in stories. She wept like a person finally setting down a trunk she had carried, long after her arms went numb. Gideon did not reach across the table and claim the moment. He waited. When she could breathe again, he said, "We can marry when you are ready. Not because the town expects it. Not because a letter promised it. When you are ready." Then, after a pause, he added, "But I would be grateful if breakfast tomorrow involved at least one child speaking louder than a church mouse." Hannah laughed. It came out broken and wet and real, and that laugh was the first sound the house kept. They were married in the church at windbreak before the first true snow. Ada stood beside Hannah with her hair brushed smooth and her chin lifted. Jonah wore boots a half size too large because Gideon insisted a boy should have room to grow into something. Nettie carried Juniper the calico rabbit down the aisle upside down by one mended ear. The minister stumbled once over the vows because Nettie whispered, very loudly, that Juniper wanted to be included, and Gideon Price smiled through all of it, like a man listening to a hymn only. He had waited years to hear. Life did not become easy. That matters. The story would be cheaper if it did. There were still hard winters, still bills, still sickness now and then, still days when Jonah forgot chores and Ada tried to carry too much, and Nettie cried like the world had cracked because her biscuit broke in two. But the difference was this. No one in that house treated the children as proof that Hannah had brought too much. Jonah learned the horses. By spring, he could find a dry crack in a strap by touch alone, and Gideon told every man in Windbreak that the boy had better hands than half the grown riders in the county. Jonah pretended not to care, but he stood taller for a week. Nettie followed Gideon everywhere. To the chicken yard, to the barn, to the creek bank when the water was low. She asked questions so steady and strange that Gideon once confessed to Hannah he had been defeated by a 3-year-old on the subject of where shadows go at night. Ada took the longest. Trust hard-won is not a door thrown open. It is a latch lifted once, then lowered again. A window cracked, a step closer to the stove. But nearly a year after Hannah came to Windbreak, the pasture gate sagged loose after a storm. Ada found Gideon with a hammer in his hand. She said it without ceremony, without planning, without looking at him directly. "Pa, the north gate is down again." Gideon did not move for a moment. Then he turned toward the broken gate very carefully, because his eyes had filled, and a man does not always want his oldest girl to see what one small word can do to him. "Then we had better fix it," he said. And Ada, who had learned to watch adults for weather, saw that the weather in him was joy. Years passed. The red mitten disappeared at some point, as children's treasures do. But Juniper, the calico rabbit, lasted far longer than cloth had any right to last. The ear Gideon mended with harness thread never lay flat. The stitches stayed crooked and brown. The knot looked like a burr forever caught in the seam. When Nettie was old enough to be embarrassed by dolls, she still kept the rabbit in a box beneath her bed. Once, Hannah offered to sew the ear properly. Nettie snatched it back. "No," she said, "that is where Pa fixed it." So Hannah left the crooked stitches alone. Of course she did, because by then she understood. Some repairs are not meant to be hidden. Some are meant to remain visible, so a child can point to the place where love sat down, took up the wrong needle, and tried anyway. The Price house was never quiet again. Boots hit the stairs. Doors banged. Jonah laughed too loudly. Nettie sang to chickens. Ada read at the table after supper and sometimes forgot to be watchful. There were muddy tracks on clean floors, spilled milk, extra blankets, too many plates. And Gideon Price, who had once sat alone at the end of a table built for 6, would sometimes stop in the middle of that noise and just listen. Hannah saw the look on his face, not patience, gratitude. And every time she saw it, she remembered the platform at Windbreak, the dust, the trunk, the 3 children pressed close, the sentence she had spoken before he could be kind. No man asks for a wife and means to get 3 children with her. and she remembered what Gideon Price had answered. He had not been trapped by politeness. He had not miscounted. He had not taken on a burden and called it charity. He had known exactly what was standing in front of him: a widow, 3 children, 1 trunk, a life louder than loneliness. Hannah had brought him the very thing his empty house had been built to hold. She had brought the noise back.